Over the past few months, I've been grinding away on several massive projects that I think you're going to really enjoy. I love making long feature-length videos like these, but the problem is that with all the research, musical composition, and animation they require, they just take so much time to make. If I want to keep working on these long-form projects, I'll have to publish shorter, more regular videos in the interim, and so I've decided to start releasing paraphrased stories from the archives of my friend Mr. Gary S. Mangiacopra. If you've read any of my books, you may recall seeing Gary's name at the top of the acknowledgement sections. Since 2017, Mr. Mangiacopra has very generously sent me hundreds of Canadian stories about ghosts, Sasquatches, lost treasure, sea serpents, extrasensory perception, UFO sightings, and other unexplained phenomena from his personal files, which comprise what I'm sure must be one of the largest collections of Forteana in North America. Some of these stories can be inserted into long-form projects like the ones on which I'm currently working, while others deserve to be thoroughly researched and presented independently. While I do intend to extend this well-warranted courtesy towards Gary's stories, I also, for financial reasons, simply need to publish more content, and so I've decided to start releasing his stories as I go through them. I would love to know what you think of this style of video, and welcome your feedback in the comments below. We will begin the first episode of this series, which I've decided to entitle Tales from the Great White North, with a Sasquatch story written by the late J.W. Burns, an Irish-Canadian schoolteacher who worked as the Indian agent at the Chehalis Reserve near Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia, throughout the 1920s and 30s. The natives with whom he worked told Burns stories about the hairy wild giants said to haunt the surrounding mountains, which still made appearances from time to time in the Agassiz-Harrison Valley. Burns began to write about these stories, and some of the articles he wrote eventually made their way into print. You may recall some of Burns' Sasquatch stories from my books Mysteries of Canada Volumes 1 and 2, and from other videos on this channel. One of Burns' stories appeared in the March 2, 1938 issue of the Chilliwack Progress, a newspaper based out of Chilliwack, British Columbia, just southwest of the Chehalis Reserve. This piece was entitled, "A Hairy Giant Sasquatch and a Huge Black Bear Engage in Mortal Combat," and unfolds just as the title purports. The story of this unusual drama in the wilderness, as the article put it, began one evening in late February 1938, when 3 local natives went out for a stroll along the banks of the Chehalis River, a narrow mountain waterway which empties into the Harrison River near the Chehalis Reserve, which in turn drains into the Fraser River to the south. The lower 7 kilometers of the Chehalis River run along a timbered flat, while its upper stretch, which cuts through the rugged Douglas Mountains, forms what is referred to as the Chehalis Canyon. While walking along the shores of the Chehalis River, not far from the terminus of the Chehalis Canyon, the 3 natives were startled by a terrific noise in the forest. "We were on our way home from an all-day unsuccessful hunt in the Chehalis Mountains," said Jimmy Craneback, one of the witnesses. "We had just crossed the government road at the Chehalis River, a mile or so north of the Indian village, when all at once we heard a roar in the forest ahead of us that shook the firs and cedars around and startled the crows and blue jays from their roost. We stopped to listen. Down the old trail ahead of us, we could hear groans, growls, thuds, and the snap and crack of rotten branches, as if Old Nick himself, that is the devil, had gone off his noodle and was running amok through the dark forest. Fearing that a Chehalis elder, while out collecting roots for basket making, might have had a run-in with a hungry bear fresh from hibernation, the hunters unshouldered their rifles and headed in the direction of the unnerving racket. 50 yards or so down the wooded trail," Craneback continued, "we came upon a sight that made our eyes pop. In awe, we stopped dead in our tracks. In the fading twilight and shadowy forest, we first thought we were looking on 2 bears fighting each other to the death. As we stood beside a log 20 yards away, we could see the great struggle of strength. There was a crunching of bones as the monsters in their rage came to grips with each other and tumbled and tossed about in their fury on the forest floor, within a few feet of the Chehalis. But there was something about one of the monsters that puzzled us. The wild animals rolled towards the Chehalis River as they grappled with each other on the forest floor, eager to avail themselves of such large game before they fell into the water and became irretrievable. The hunters raised their rifles and prepared to shoot, when one of the animals bellowed an articulation which sounded almost human. When Burns asked Jimmy Craneback to attempt to replicate the sound he had heard, the native said that it sounded something like the syllables poo-woo-woo. The astonished hunters held their fire, realizing that one of the combatants was a Sasquatch, one of the legendary wild men of the mountains. One of the friends, named Ike Joe, suggested that they take the side of the Sasquatch since it's well to be on their side. Burns appears to have implied that the hunters alleged to have assisted the Sasquatch in his battle with the bear, but whether they did so with their rifles or physically threw themselves into the fray, the Indian agent did not specify. After a ferocious brawl, lasting what the hunters estimated to be about 10 minutes, the Sasquatch wrapped his hairy arms around the Bruin's throat and squeezed the life out of it. "It must have been a humdinger of a hold," said Jimmy Craneback, for the bear began to gasp for breath, and gasping pawed the air as his tongue was hanging out. The wild man had won the fight. With a grunt, he flung the carcass of the bear into the river. It was a skookum fight, Craneback concluded, skookum being a Chinook jargon word meaning powerful or impressive. And as no one of our little party had ever seen a hairy giant of the Sasquatch in a fight before, I'm telling you, we got the biggest kick of our life. From Newfoundland to Prince Edward Island, Canada's Atlantic provinces are home to some of the richest folklore in all the country. This notion is attested to by the metaphorical library of maritime folktale collections compiled by local historians, like Frank Harold MacArthur's 1966 book, Legends of Prince Edward Island, and Helen Crichton's 1957 classic, Blue Nose Ghosts. The archives of Fortean scholar Mr. Gary S. Mangiacopra contain many forgotten tales of haunted lighthouses, sea serpents, and phantom ships endemic to Canada's Atlantic Northeast, which add to the growing body of material that is the folklore of Eastern Canada. We will explore some of those stories in this video. One of the items in Mr. Mangiacopra's archive is an article in the September 1st, 1975 issue of The Hartford Courant, an American newspaper based out of Hartford, Connecticut. The piece, which was written by journalist John Lacey and entitled Newfoundland Ghosts Linger, details the author's interview with Hartford resident Robert Russell, whom Lacey wrote was a boy growing up in Newfoundland in horse and buggy days. Russell began his meeting with Lacey by sharing anecdotes about his childhood in the town of Bay Roberts, on Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula. Back in the 1910s and 20s, for example, young Russell and his fellow students were each required to carry a bundle of wood to class each morning, in order to ensure that the potbelly stove in the town's one-room schoolhouse had the fuel it needed to drive away the damp Atlantic chill. Russell told Lacey about the pungent dried cod that was a staple in his family home, and about the many inlets and coves which featured in some of his earliest childhood memories. After reminiscing for some time, Russell produced a homemade book entitled Folklore History of Newfoundland, a mishmash of forgotten ghost stories and local historical anecdotes, typewritten on paper of varying thickness, gathered directly from the people of Newfoundland. One of the tales in Russell's book is set in Lark Harbour, a small fishing community which lies at the heart of Newfoundland's desolate western coast, a region known as the French Shore, on account of a bygone treaty which once gave French fishermen the right to cast their nets into its rough waters. Long ago, the story goes, a ship crewed by some of those Gallic sailors was tossed into a cluster of sea rocks in the Bay of Islands, not far from Lark Harbour, and sank with all hands. There were no survivors, wrote the book's nameless author, but when a storm blows up, you can hear the cries of drowned sailors calling for help. Another story in Russell's book takes place in Bon Bay, another tiny community on Newfoundland's western shore, located at the base of the Great Northern Peninsula and the edge of Gros Morne National Park. Many years ago, so the tale goes, a large ship sank in the natural harbor for which Bond Bay is named. One evening, about 20 or 30 years after it had sunk, wrote the unnamed folklorist, the people heard a noise in the harbor. What did they see but the ship coming towards the shore, same as the day she went down. The ship was shining with lights, but nobody was seen on board. She came in to about 1 mile from shore, and then she disappeared. The last story referenced in Lacey's article told of a 16-year-old girl from Woody Point, a village just south of Bond Bay, who died after suffering epileptic convulsions. During the funeral service, the folklorist wrote, they heard a knocking from the coffin. The undertakers, having shoveled the earth over her, were startled and started to dig savagely. When they opened the coffin, she was face down, and her eyes were open as if she had died of fright. The question arises, how many people have been buried alive? Another maritime tale in Mr. Mangiacopra's archive is an article entitled The Phantom Ship, which appeared in the May 1954 issue of the magazine Fate. The author, one Roy Grant of Warwick East, Bermuda, claimed that his father had an unusual experience in about 1904 while sailing with 6 other men on the Northumberland Strait, the strip of Atlantic Ocean which separates Prince Edward Island from the mainland provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. As my father told the story, Grant wrote, it was just after sundown and not yet dark, and he was steering the schooner. One of the men said, "Look out! Don't you see that ship coming across our bow?" Father looked and saw a full-rigged ship going across the bow, not more than 200 yards away. The men watched the ship, and when it was about a half-mile off, it suddenly burst into flames. Then they knew that it was a phantom ship. Rather than flee from the ghostly spectacle, Grant's father and his fellow sailors decided to approach the burning schooner head-on. As if in response, the spectral vessel instantly set sail and drifted away from them at exactly the same speed. First, the sails and rigging seemed to burn brightly, Grant wrote. Then the entire hull appeared to be on fire. During this time, the figure of a man could be seen quite clearly walking along the deck. The astonished shipmates pulled every trick in the book in an effort to overtake the mysterious craft, but no matter how fast they sailed towards it, the phantom ship remained the same distance ahead of them. As they tailed it, their phantasmal quarry slowly began to sink, lower and lower into the water, as if it were being consumed by the inferno which engulfed it. When the tip of its mast finally kissed the surface of the water, the flame separated into 3 great balls of fire. These fireballs skipped along the waves for some time, before coming back together again, flaring up into a roaring blaze as they rejoined. This great conflagration eventually subsided to reveal the original schooner, whole and unconsumed once again, which sailed on unmolested for a brief spell, before bursting into flames just as before, repeating the cycle. Grant's father and his fellow shipmates maintained their futile pursuit all night long, until finally, at dawn, the ghostly schooner melted into the twilight. The fiery phantom ship which Grant's father described, referred to by some authors as the ghost ship of the Northumberland Strait, evokes another spectral schooner, seen from time to time near Nova Scotia's famous Oak Island. This mystery ship is believed to be the ghost of an American privateer called the Young Teaser, whose gunpowder supply was set ablaze by a suicidal sailor during a naval battle in the War of 1812. But that's a story for another time. In the not-so-distant past, it was common for ordinary people who witnessed extraordinary phenomena to preface retellings of their experience with the assurance, "I'm not the kind of person who believes in flying saucers," as if the concept of unidentified flying objects was so absurd that any serious consideration of the subject constituted a boundary stone separating the credible from the fanciful. Due to astonishing revelations made by the United States Department of Defense in the summer of 2021, however, sightings of what the Pentagon has styled unidentified aerial phenomena have rapidly become perhaps the only secular variety of unexplained phenomena to gain some modicum of public acceptance in the Western world. Long before the American Director of National Intelligence released the DoD's unclassified preliminary assessment of unidentified aerial phenomena on June 25, 2021, ufologists, or students of the UFO phenomenon, have quietly, diligently documented thousands of sightings of mysterious flying objects all over the world, most of which took place between the 1940s and the present day. One of those ufologists is American researcher Gary S. Mangiacopra, curator of what is perhaps the most extensive archive dedicated to the subject of unexplained phenomena in the world. We are going to dust off some forgotten UFO reports from Mr. Mangiacopra's files, all of which took place in Canada, and present them for the first time in this video. In return for permission to release these stories, Mr. Mangiacopra has asked that I give a shout out to his friend Ted Dodds, a fellow American researcher specialized in the subjects of lost treasure and Old West history. Over the years, Mr. Dodds has accumulated his own archive filled with old out-of-print magazines on lost mines, treasure hunting, and the history of North America's Wild West. Mr. Dodds, for the purpose of paying medical bills, is now selling some of the valuable magazines from his archive piecemeal for very affordable prices. If you would like to acquire some of these priceless pieces of history and help out Mr. Dodds in the process, please feel free to call him at 1-503-538-4478 or send him a letter via snail mail. For more information, please check out doddsmagazines.com. That's DOADES magazines.com. The first UFO sighting we will examine took place sometime after Sunday, July 27, 1947, just off Pelly Island, a 12-kilometer-long isle near the western end of Lake Erie, just north of Ontario's border with Ohio. The witness, one R.C. Schramm, sent a description of his sighting to the editor of the magazine Fate, who printed it in the fall 1948 issue of that publication. That week, Schramm headed out on a long-awaited fishing trip with his friend, Mr. W. Gormley, perhaps embarking at Windsor, Ontario, or one of the smaller municipalities scattered along Lake Erie's northern shore. The anglers headed out to Scudder Bay, at Pelly Island's northern end, cast their lines, and slowly began to troll towards Lighthouse Point, where the eponymous Pelly Island Lighthouse stands. All at once, Schramm wrote, a large round disc appeared in the sky. It was as round as the moon, and about 50 feet in diameter. It was stationary in the sky, and as near as I could judge, no more than 100 feet in the air. A dull metallic disc. It had the round flat side toward us, and we couldn't tell how thick it was. It was dull aluminum in color. Schramm pointed the spectacle out to Gormley, and the two fishermen stared at the silent hovering disc in mute amazement. At that very moment, a strident chirping erupted from the back of the boat, announcing a bite on one of their lines. The anglers peeled their eyes away from the aerial mystery to reel in the fish, and by the time they hauled their catch into the boat, the flying object had disappeared. It was a clear sunny day, Schramm wrote, and we could see for many miles in all directions. It must have had tremendous speed to get out of sight in the short time we reeled in the fish. R.C. Schramm was not the only Canadian to report seeing a flying saucer that week. On Saturday, July 26, 1947, Mr. Charles Franklin of the hamlet of Marlborough, in west-central Alberta, caught a glimpse of a mysterious flying object while driving home from the easterly city of Edmonton with his children, Clarence and Isabel. At around 8 o'clock p.m., while driving on the Yellowhead Highway about 47 miles outside of town, in the vicinity of Entwistle, Alberta, Franklin and his children saw a clearly defined disc hovering at the edge of some dark clouds ahead of them, directly to the west. Miss Isabel Franklin, whose version of the event appeared in the July 30th, 1947 issue of the Edmonton Journal, wrote, "It was so clearly visible against the dark cloud bank, but with the sun shining on it from the southwest, that we saw it simultaneously. a distinct silvery-colored disk, traveling so swiftly westward that it disappeared in the space of perhaps a half-minute. Although it was difficult to judge, the object must have been at least from 4 to 5 miles away when we first saw it, and was moving so swiftly that it appeared to be going lower as it moved west and faded into the distance. "We do not wish to hazard a guess as to what it might have been," Isabel concluded, "but flying saucer seems to be a most apt description of its appearance." Around the same time as Schramm and Franklin sightings, Mrs. Wary Waltenberg of Southampton, Ontario, a community on the western shores of Lake Huron, about 190 miles northeast of Pelly Island, claimed to have seen a mysterious flying object from the comfort of her own home. Unable to sleep on account of a pain in her shoulder, Mrs. Waltenberg got out of bed one night in late July 1947 and gazed out her bedroom window. To her astonishment, she spotted a strange lighted object hovering in the sky. Newspaper articles which described her account quoted her as saying that the object opened and closed 3 times, revealing bright lights or stars inside. Another contemporaneous spate of UFO sightings took place in British Columbia's Upper Fraser Valley. Although most of these alleged sightings were only vaguely alluded to in tangentially related newspaper articles, the July 30th, 1947 issue of the Chilliwack Progress ran with a story describing a sighting which took place that very evening. 5 residents of Cultus Lake, a recreational destination just south of the city of Chilliwack, British Columbia, which native Chilliwack Indians incidentally designated as Slalakum, or Place of Mystery, reported seeing a flying saucer between 7 and 8 p.m., floating in a southwesterly direction several hundred feet above a mountain range south of the lake. It seemed to be in aluminum color, the article contended, and glinted in the setting sun. No sound as of an aeroplane was audible. Authorities from the Royal Canadian School of Military Academy, stationed at Camp Chilliwack, a local Canadian Forces base, proposed that the flying saucer was probably a flare parachute, perhaps taking their cue from a number of newspaper articles which purported that the recent regional rash of UFO sightings could be attributed to weather balloons released in the southerly state of Washington. The remains of such a balloon were discovered by Bernard Hawley, an inspector for the British Columbia Department of Fisheries, just several days earlier, hanging from a tree on Nikomin Island, just east of Chilliwack, prompting newspapers across the province to dismiss all local flying saucer reports as misidentifications of this meteorological aircraft. As one article explained, the diameter of the balloon is approximately 4 feet, and from a distance would appear to be circular. The balloon ascends to a height of 4 miles, and automatically bursts. As the equipment descends on a parachute, an enclosed radio broadcasts weather conditions. Whether the contemporaneous UFO sightings reported by Schramm and Gormley, Mrs. Waltenberg, and the Franklin family could also be explained by weather balloons, authorities did not venture to guess. All over the world, there are certain special spots which local tradition contends are haunted by solitary, ghostly women clad in monochromatic garments. The stately Fairmont Hotel, Vancouver, for example, is said to be haunted by the specter of a local socialite who appears to guests in a glamorous red dress. Nova Scotia's iconic Peggy's Cove Lighthouse is said to be the purgatorial domicile of a forlorn phantom in a blue gown who weeps for some bygone tragedy which history has long forgotten. Victoria Hall in Cobourg, Ontario is supposed to be the domain of the Lady in Green, Queen's Park, Toronto the abode of the Grey Lady, and the Capitol Theatre in Hamilton, Ontario, the residence of the Lady in Black. Of all the shades and colors which feminine phantasms are said to affect, white is by far the most popular. Some folklorists who have written on the subject have observed that supposed backstories associated with ghostly women in white often involve heartbreak, lost loves, abandonment, betrayal, and unrequited love being recurring themes. In this video, we're going to explore a few of the many Canadian legends of the Lady in White. The first of our stories takes place in the hamlet of Thornton, Ontario, about a 15-minute drive south of the city of Barrie, not far from Lake Simcoe. At the heart of this tiny community, at the junction of the main drag, Barrie Street, and perpendicular Robert Street, sits a charming 170-year-old Victorian mansion, surmounted by a large white sign bearing the words, "The Queen's." Throughout the 2010s, prior to the imposition of provincial restrictions related to the recent pandemic, this building housed both the Vidya Center for Yoga and Wellness and an associated vegan restaurant. In the first decade of the 21st century, the historic structure was the site of a fine dining restaurant called the Village Inn. Throughout the 20th century and much of the 19th, however, this elegant manor served the function for which it was originally intended, namely that of a stopping place for Ontario travelers, originally operating under the name the Queen's Hotel. For decades, patrons and staff of the various establishments for which the historic building has served as headquarters have reported seeing a mysterious woman in a white dress standing at the top of one of the staircases leading to the second floor, walking along the mezzanine above the main floor lounge, and gazing mournfully from the balcony which overlooks Barrie Street. Ontario folklorists Andrew Hind and Maria de Silva described several encounters with this female phantom, known locally as the Lady of the Stairs, in their article in the spring 2009 issue of the magazine Mysteries. One evening in 1996, for example, an interior decorator named Andree Naud and her boyfriend, Tim, were enjoying a candlelit dinner on the Village Inn mezzanine, when Naud noticed a strange woman peering at them through a glass door, which separated the dining area from a wing which once held the old hotel's guest rooms. "I saw this sickly woman staring at me through the sheer curtain," Naud told Hind and De Silva. "I couldn't define a face, but she looked ill. This woman kept staring at me, and I thought to myself, that's pretty rude, so I stared right back. Then she disappeared." Alarmed, Naud informed a waitress of her troubling experience, and watched the color drain from her face. Although the wing of the building in which the mystery woman had stood was sometimes rented out to tenants, no one had occupied it in over a week, and there were no other female staff members on duty that night. Another strange incident occurred one dark and stormy night in August 2005, when the hamlet of Thornton was beset by a terrific downpour. A woman whom Hind and De Silva referred to as Terry drove up to the restaurant with her husband and was surprised to see a woman standing on the balcony, clad in a thin white shift which offered no protection from the pouring rain. Terry made eye contact with the mysterious lady and was instantly overcome by a bone-chilling cold and an overwhelming sensation of sorrow. All throughout dinner, Terry found herself unable to shake the oppressive feelings which had assailed her. Seeking relief, she excused herself and made her way towards the bathroom on the first floor. As she walked down the stairs, she had the distinct impression that someone was walking directly behind her, but when she turned her head, no one was there. Once inside the bathroom, Terry headed over to the sink and attempted to calm her nerves. As she stood before the mirror, she heard the clicking of high-heeled footsteps approaching her from behind. A quick glance assured her that she was alone. Terry's heart hammered in her chest, and the hairs of her neck stood on end. She had never felt so terrified in all her life. For a few moments, she stood weak-kneed, frozen with fear, waiting with bated breath for the inevitable culmination of her run-in with the Lady of the Stairs. She was jarred from her paralysis by the clattering of a bar of soap, which slid into the sink as if it had been flicked by invisible fingers, and ran shrieking from the bathroom. Other unexplainable experiences which have taken place in the Queen's Hotel over the years include phantom footsteps on the second floor, electric lights mysteriously turning on and off, the inexplicable rearrangement of antique furniture, and 2 incidents in which kegs of beer froze solid in the fridge, immediately following a journalistic inquiry into the alleged haunting. Local legend has it that the Lady of the Stairs is the ghost of a female guest who stayed in the Queen's Hotel with her husband in the late 1800s. In the midst of a heated argument in her room on the second floor, the woman broke away from her spouse and fled downstairs. While descending the staircase, she tripped on her dress and tumbled awkwardly. By the time her body came to rest at the base of the stairs, the woman was dead. Although there are no records of such an incident taking place at the Queen's Hotel, many Thornton residents remain as firmly convinced of its veracity as they are that the old building is haunted. As Hyndon de Silva put it, until such time as the ghost's full story can be brought to light, the forlorn lady of the stairs may remain trapped within the quaint confines of the establishment, an unwitting, non-paying patron. Another Canadian ghost story involving a woman in white is set on a tiny rocky inlet near the southern tip of Vancouver Island. This haunted spot, called Dyke Point, lies at the northern lip of Thetis Cove, the latter being an appendage of Esquimalt Harbour, abutting a natural area called Portage Park, near what pioneer letters indicate was once an old Indian burial ground. Every once in a while, locals report seeing a young woman in a white dress, standing on the point, gazing mournfully out to sea, her long hair flowing in the breeze. This melancholy apparition does not interact with witnesses, simply fading into nothingness moments after being seen. This so-called White Lady of Thetis Cove has also been spotted standing on a small beach at the edge of Portage Park, staring vacantly past Richards Island, which obstructs one's view of the harbor. In his 2017 book, The Haunting of Vancouver Island, Supernatural Encounters with the Other Side, Victoria author Shannon Sin recounted a local legend, which holds that the White Lady of Thetis Cove is the ghost of a woman whose husband or fiancé died at sea, who still waits in vain for his safe return. One old tradition holds that the woman was related to the family who once owned and operated nearby 4 Mile House, a historic inn located a mere 250 meters north of the aforementioned beach and more than a half-kilometer northeast of Dyke Point, at the northern end of Portage Park. 4 Mile House was established in 1858 and taken over by an Englishman named Peter Calvert in 1870, remaining under Calvert management until 1917. Incidentally, this antique building, which now houses a brewpub, is said to be home to several ghostly tenants itself. After wading through a cloudy mire of historic documents and local folklore, Sin tentatively identified the White Lady of Thetis Cove as the shade of Margaret Montgomery, once a frequent visitor to 4 Mile House, whose sister, Elizabeth Calvert, was married to the Englishman who took over management of the inn in 1870. Margaret died in 1872, at the age of 19, succumbing to a heart condition which had plagued her since childhood. In all likelihood, Sin wrote, Elizabeth would have tried to introduce Margaret to prospective partners, many who would have been ship officers. Today, the 4 Mile Brewing Company, which operates out of 4 Mile House, honors the legend of the White Lady by proudly displaying a stained glass depiction of the phantom in their establishment, and serving a beverage called a White Lady, which consists of coffee, Bailey's Irish Cream, and Frangelico liqueur. The third and final White Lady we will meet in this video is said to make her appearances in an old vacation cottage south of the town of Parry Sound, Ontario, on the eastern shores of Lake Huron's Georgian Bay, in a region called Muskoka. Built in 1890, this quaint Victorian relic has housed guests ever since steamships first opened up the Muskoka wilds to sportsmen seeking reprieve from the big city, one of whom appears to have taken up permanent residence. In his 1997 book, Haunted Lakes, Great Lakes Ghost Stories, Superstitions, and Sea Serpents, American historian Frederick Stonehouse detailed some of the strange experiences said to have taken place at this nameless lakeside cabin. In the summer of 1980, for example, a young female schoolteacher spotted a woman dressed in a long, old-fashioned white dress and a wide-brimmed hat disappear into the woods behind the cottage. Several years later, a hard-headed engineer, whom Stonehouse cited as Dr. Bell, spotted the pale face of a white-clad woman staring at him from behind a window while touring the grounds with the cabin owner. When he called the owner's attention towards the woman, the figure disappeared. According to Stonehouse, The owner of the cottage has no idea as to the identity of her mysterious non-paying tenant, but has a distinct impression that her intention is to look after the cabin, and feels reassured by her presence. Whether she was the victim of some long-forgotten Georgian Bay tragedy, or a former guest drawn to the cottage after death, the legendary ghost of Perry's Sound, like that of Thetis Cove and the Queen's Inn, is another mystifying addition to the bevy of Canadian phantoms whom folklore has styled the Ladies in White. In his 1993 book, Unnatural History: True Manitoba Mysteries, author Chris Rutkowski, a man generally considered to be one of Canada's leading experts on the subject of unidentified flying objects, wrote, "Ufologists recognize several periods of significant increases in the number of UFO sightings. These are called flap years: 1896 to 1897, 1947, 1952 to 1954, 1957, 1966 to 1967, and 1973 to 1975. That this pattern applies to Canadian UFO sightings, as Rutkowski later points out in his book, is bolstered by a number of articles filed away in the archives of Rutkowski's American counterpart, Mr. Gary S. Mangiacopra, which describe a succession of UFO sightings in the early 1950s. One such article, entitled Canada Hunts for Flying Saucers, written by John C. Ross, aka Curtis Fuller, for the May 1954 issue of the magazine Fate, details a number of alleged UFO sightings made during the early 50s flap. All of them took place in or near North Bay, Ontario, a city on the northeastern shores of Lake Nipissing, just northwest of Algonquin Provincial Park. The sightings began in the fall of 1951, when 3 of the city's residents, all of them standing on a different shore of Lake Nipissing, spotted a bright silver sphere making strange maneuvers over the lake in broad daylight. Over the next 3 years, 16 people reported nighttime sightings of mysterious orange-colored spheres in the North Bay area. One witness claimed that the sphere he saw came out of the northeastern skies, wandered back and forth across the horizon, then vanished. In addition to cavorting over Lake Nipissing, strange orange-red discs appeared on several occasions over the newly established Royal Canadian Air Force Base just north of the city, a CFB station founded in 1951, ironically for the purpose of aerial surveillance and defense. On January 1st, 1952, RCAF Warrant Officer W.J. Yo watched the strange object circle, dive, and zigzag over the base's airstrip for 8 minutes. 4 months later, on April 12, 1952, Warrant Officer E.H. Roselle and Flight Sergeant R. McRae saw an amber-colored aerial sphere approach from the southwest. The mysterious globe hovered over the airstrip for some time, before returning along the route by which it had arrived, climbing into the sky at a 30-degree angle for 2 minutes, before disappearing from view. Incidentally, at the height of the UFO Flap of 1957, CFB North Bay was transformed into a major NORAD base, the North American Air Defense Command being a Cold War alliance between the US and Canadian Air Forces, formed for the purpose of protecting and surveying North American airspace. Today, an enormous underground complex designed to withstand a nuclear blast lies 60 stories beneath it. Another article in Mr. Mangiacopra's archive, entitled Special Saucer Report, which appeared in the June 1953 issue of the magazine Fate, chronicles an unusual cluster of UFO sightings concentrated within a 10-day period in the latter part of January 1953, smack in the middle of the aforementioned flap. The first incident took place on January 21st, when 2 American fighter pilots made a routine flight over Japan. Not far from the Kuril Islands, and the island of Sakhalin, which Japan had formally ceded to the Soviet Union just 2 years prior, in the culmination of a contentious territorial dispute, the airmen spotted rotating clusters of red, white, and green lights, hovering in the sky. The things were simultaneously picked up on radar by a US Air Force crew on the ground, apparently proving that they constituted one or more material objects. After hanging motionless in the air for some time, the lights zipped away with blinding speed. This unnerving report prompted the US Air Force to declassify two similar incidents that had taken place in Japan in the recent past. Back on March 29, 1952, while conducting an aerial exercise near the city of Misawa, Lieutenant David C. Brigham saw a tiny, shiny disk descend from above and interpose itself between his own aircraft and an adjacent F-84 Thunderjet. He described the mysterious object as being about 8 inches in diameter, very thin, round, and as shiny as polished chromium. It had no projections and left no exhaust or vapor trails. Although the object did not appear to have any markings, there was reportedly a ripple in the metal skin. To Brigham's horror, the little disc darted directly towards the Thunderjet, stopped within 20 feet of the aircraft, then flipped at a 90-degree angle. The strange object proceeded to flutter for approximately 3 seconds, before maneuvering around the Thunderjet and then shooting up and out of sight. The second previous incident had taken place on December 29, 1952, when Colonel Donald J. M. Blakesley, a decorated World War II flying ace, spotted a cluster of strange lights while flying near the same spot at which the January 21st sightings took place. Like his anonymous successors, Blakesley described seeing a rotating cluster of red, green, and white lights hovering in the air. The veteran pilot extinguished all the lights in his cockpit in order to determine whether the strange aerial phenomenon was simply a reflection on the glass. When the rotating lights did not dissipate, Blakesley turned his lights back on and converged on the floating cluster, prompting it to fly away at mind-bending speed. While discs were appearing in Japan, the article continues, they also were appearing in the United States. 4 days after the January 21st, 1953 report, a mysterious cigar-shaped object was spotted in the sky near Fort Worth, Texas. It changed color several times, before flying away with terrific speed. According to an article in the April 1953 issue of the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association, a 4-month-old Hereford calf was seen observing this UFO intently and inclined her head in order to get a better view of the spectacle. After the strange visitor departed, the calf was unable to return her head to its normal position. In the days following the incident, the Hereford continued to stare vacantly at the sky, without displaying the slightest appetite, her eyes rhythmically moving back and forth. Unable to treat her mysterious condition, the owner had the calf euthanized. A subsequent autopsy revealed an abscess in the animal's brain. 3 days after the sighting at Fort Worth, on January 28th, U.S. servicemen stationed in a control tower at the Marine Air Base in El Toro, California, witnessed the appearance of a large, fiery aerial disc. When approached by a fighter jet, the object made a speedy escape. That same day, Navy Air Instructors Lieutenant Commander Norikis and Captain E.H. Haynes spotted a blinding white light while flying 8,000 feet over the naval outlying landfield Barron in Foley, Alabama. The strange luminescence was simultaneously spotted by Chief Air Controllers E.F. Hudson and Wave Muriel Titus on the ground below. After hovering in the air for about 45 seconds, the light changed color and took off northwest toward the city of Mobile. I watched it for about 45 minutes, Titus was quoted as having said. At first I thought it was a bright star, but then it started to pulsate and change colors. First it was a brilliant white, then it would change to red and then to green. The day after the El Toro and Foley sightings, a Northrop aircraft test pilot named Rexy Hardy, who had formerly served as a lieutenant commander in the Navy Air Service, noticed 4 strange objects gliding through the air in tandem while flying his own plane over Malibu, California. They were about the size of a B-36, he told a reporter for the Los Angeles Examiner, but circular in shape. They were clearly defined. They were of aluminum color and in a definite flight pattern. Their speed was around 1,200 miles per hour. They were definitely not balloons, nor any type of aircraft I have ever seen. Around that same time, other strange lights were seen over Petoskey, Grand Rapids, and Sandusky, Michigan. Some witnesses, including farmers Irvin Geek, Michael Lawler, Carl Kohler, and Seville Hamolt, described seeing a light which seemed to revolve counterclockwise, which hovered in the sky for some time, descended slowly, then disappeared. American servicemen were not the only witnesses to report mysterious flying objects in late January 1953. Across Lake Huron from the Michigan sightings, about an hour and a half's drive west of North Bay, in the city of Sudbury, Ontario, Mr. and Mrs. Russell Howard and two of their neighbors claimed to have watched two silvery torpedo-shaped objects move slowly across the sky, passing directly over a mining district called Copper Cliff as it made its way toward the Great Lake. The witnesses watched the object for half an hour before it disappeared from view. And so, the article concludes, ends another in the endless series of strange and unidentified, unknown but unknowable aerial phenomena. In his 1872 adventure novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, French novelist Jules Verne wrote, "The human mind enjoys impressive visions of unearthly creatures. Now then, the sea is precisely their best medium, the only setting suitable for the breeding and growing of such giants, next to which such land animals as elephants or rhinoceroses are mere dwarves. The liquid masses support the largest known species of mammals, and perhaps conceal mollusks of incomparable size, or crustaceans too frightful to contemplate. Why not? Formerly, in prehistoric days, land animals were built on a gigantic scale. Our Creator cast them using a colossal mold that time has gradually made smaller. With its untold depths, couldn't the sea keep alive such huge specimens of life from another age? This sea that never changes, while the land masses undergo almost continuous alteration. Couldn't the heart of the ocean hide the last remaining varieties of these titanic species, for whom years are centuries and centuries millennia?" Many residents of Canada's west coast, both past and present, certainly seem to think so, and with good reason. Long before Spanish, English, or Russian sails first appeared off the shores of what is now British Columbia, First Nations throughout the Pacific Northwest told stories about massive marine monsters endowed with preternatural abilities, which ruled the waves between Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii. The Tlingit of northwestern British Columbia and the Alaskan Panhandle, for example, told stories about the Gonakadet, or sea wolf, who lived in a den at the bottom of the sea, on whose physical appearance and essential nature not all storytellers were in agreement. Some anthropologists described the Gonakadet as an enormous animal, shaped like a longhouse, which was greatly feared for its ability to devour entire canoes, crew and all, while others described it as a benevolent creature with sharp teeth, claws, fins, long ears, and a long tail, which brings good luck to all who see it. Further to the south, the Bella Bella and Tsimshian of the Great Bear Rainforest told stories about the Skampk, a huge water monster which bit off human arms and legs and swallowed people whole, and believed in the existence of a fish with preternatural power, resembling a double-headed salmon. Undoubtedly, the richest collection of legendary sea monsters endemic to Canada's Pacific Northwest is that which populates the traditional folklore of Vancouver Island. The Kwakwaka'wakw, who once ruled the island's northeastern shores from Cape Scott to Campbell River, told stories about monstrous halibut, ferocious underwater birds, and vicious grinning sharks with long tongues and bull-like heads. The Nootka, who held sway over the island's western coast, believed in a sea spirit called Kaptka, who appeared as a drowned giantess floating in the ocean, her long hair streaming all around her. Those who managed to pluck one of her hairs from the water would receive wealth and power thereafter, but none who caught a glimpse of her face lived to tell the tale. All native residents of Vancouver Island, including the northern and central coast Salish, who occupied the island's southeastern quadrant, told stories about two specific types of oceanic entities, namely Komokwa, the generous and wealthy chief of the sea, and Sissyudel, a giant two-headed amphibious sea serpent saturated with preternatural power, said to be the mortal enemy of the Thunderbird. Sightings of huge, unidentified sea creatures are still reported from time to time in the waters off Vancouver Island. The most famous subject of such accounts is an alleged sea serpent called Cadborosaurus, or Caddy, who is said to occasionally rear his horse-like head and display his serpentine trunk in Cadboro Bay on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, not far from the University of Victoria. Since at least the 1940s, newspapers across British Columbia have recognized Caddy as one of the province's 3 classic monsters, alongside the Sasquatch of the coastal mountains and the Ogopogo of Lake Okanagan. While this author certainly intends to give Caddy his due in some future work, this piece will explore 3 lesser-known monster sightings, made in some of the more obscure bays and sounds off Vancouver Island, all of them from the archives of Gary Mangiacopra. The first of these reports was submitted by 41-year-old George W. Sagers and published in the summer 1948 issue of the magazine Fate. The author, who hailed from the municipality of Ucluelet on the western shore of Vancouver Island, was a commercial fisherman who spent most of his waking hours at sea, having commenced his career at the age of 13 in his father's rowboat. At the time of writing, Sagers was the proud owner of what he described as one of the most up-to-date commercial trolling boats, equipped with radio telephone, direction finder, and photoelectric pilot. One day, in November 1947, George Sagers left Ucluelet Harbor about an hour before daylight, as was his custom. When he reached a point about 2 miles offshore, southwest of a landmark called the Amphitrite Point Lighthouse, he lowered his fishing poles, slowed the engine, put his lines and hooks on the water, and slowly headed out to sea. After trolling for about a mile, Sagers got a bite on one of his lines and reeled in what proved to be a large salmon. Just as he prepared to haul the fish into his boat, Sagers was beset by a peculiar sensation. "A sort of shiver went up and down my spine," he wrote, "and I had a feeling that I was being watched. Immediately, I looked all around. On my port side, about 150 feet away, was a head and neck raised about 4 feet above the water, with 2 jet-black eyes, about 3 inches across, and protruding from the head like a couple of buns, staring at me. It just didn't look real. I've never seen anything like it. The head seemed to be the same size as the neck, about 18 inches through, and of a mottled color of gray and light brown. This particular morning there was quite a groundswell, with a chop, which meant that anything floating on or close to the surface would certainly do a lot of tossing about. But this sea monster was very steady, which only proved to me that there was plenty of it under the water. If it had made one move toward the boat, I was prepared to run into the cabin and slam the door shut. It had a look I distrusted greatly. After it looked at me for 1 full minute, it turned its head straight away from me, showing the back of its head and its neck. It appeared to have some sort of mane, which seemed like bundles of warts rather than hair. It looked something like a mattress would, if split down the middle, allowing rolls of cotton batting to protrude. The color of the mane was dark brown. Then the monster went down out of sight, moving so quietly that it never left a ripple or disturbance of any kind in the water. My name is George W. Sagers. I live at Ucluelet, BC, Vancouver Island, Canada. What I have told you is true." Another sea serpent, this one answering to the general description of Caddy, appeared off the eastern shores of Vancouver Island on February 24th, 1954, just north of the city of Parksville. About 30 witnesses claim to have seen the strange sea creature basking in the sun about 380 yards offshore. Mr. W. Baldwin, a resident of the nearby community of Errington, had the best view of the spectacle, watching it from shore through field glasses. "I never saw anything like it," he told a reporter for the Nanaimo Daily News, describing the creature as having a head that was both reptilian and horse-like, and a long tapering tail. He estimated the creature to measure between 30 to 40 feet in length, and described it as having 4 humps. After watching the creature disport itself for about an hour, 6 locals, including Arthur Stewart and his brother of nearby Horn Lake, and Chuck Ball of the proximate community of Dashwood, approached the monster in a rowboat, hoping to capture it on camera. Apparently startled by their approach, the sea serpent submerged and shortly reappeared on the other side of the rowboat. Then it made a beeline for them, Baldwin told reporters, but submerged for good in about 50 yards. Thoroughly spooked, the 6 adventurers made a hasty retreat to the shore. The third and final sea serpent sighting we will examine in this piece took place in 1928 in Alert Bay, a piece of ocean nestled in the crook of Cormorant Island, near the northern end of Vancouver Island. This sighting was alluded to in an article in the July 19, 1963 issue of the Vancouver Sun, written by a female columnist from Ladysmith, BC, who wrote under the pen name Mamie Maloney. This witness was Maloney's own husband, T.R. Boggs, who claimed to have seen a camel-like head, raised 5 or 6 feet out of the water, gliding against the waves, with definite humps, occasionally breaking the surface for 50 or so feet behind. Boggs was purportedly reluctant to tell his story to anyone he did not know well. Quote, defeated by the, let's humor him, he's so sane in other respects looks his tale invariably evoked. One night, while reading in bed, Boggs allegedly found the explanation for his sighting in the book Vancouver Island's West Coast, 1762 to 1962, by George Nicholson. This book contains a 2-page chapter which attempts to provide a conventional explanation for sightings of caddy and other sea serpents off the shores of Vancouver Island. The apparition so often observed off Cadborough Bay, the chapter began, is no sea serpent, although to the novice, that's what it sometimes looks like. The chapter proceeds to explain that the sea serpent is really an optical illusion, produced by a bull sea lion leading his harem across the water. The bull always leads, the article explains, every so often breaking the surface to hold his head at least 3 feet above the water and look around as if to see if any strange bachelor bull might be skulking around. The big head, high on a thick neck, seen unexpectedly and only for a brief time, could, with the help of a little imagination, be described as that of a camel, horse, the legendary dragon, the mythical sea serpent, or a combination of them all. So much for the head and neck. Now for the humps or coils. The females always follow close behind, invariably in line, and for some unexplained reason they never raise their heads out of the water. The fierce-looking, bewhiskered head of the bull sea lion, high out of the water, followed a length or two behind by one or more arched bodies of the females, and all appearing to be part of one animal, admittedly looks like a sea serpent. Whether such an explanation could account for the eerie experience of George Saggers, a nautical veteran who had spent 27 years on the waves at the time of his sighting, or the traditional tales told by the natives of Vancouver Island, whose ancestors knew the sea and its inhabitants as well as any man knows his own backyard, is a matter of conjecture. In late February 2022, residents of the Victoria Park district of Kitchener, Ontario, reported hearing loud booms in their neighborhood, for which there appeared to be no discernible source. Witnesses likened the mysterious noises to gunshots, the backfires of an engine, and cannon blasts, claiming that some booms were so loud that they rattled the windows of their houses. In mid-March, Canadian journalist Krista Sharp investigated the case on behalf of CTV News, and quickly uncovered the culprits. The mystery booms, it turned out, were the backfires of 2 portable generators at the local Ukrainian Catholic Center, which powered a temporary heating system, the original having been damaged by meltwater. Not all mysterious explosions are so easy to explain. Every once in a while, hapless witnesses across North America are rocked by tremendous sonic blasts, which seem to emerge out of nowhere, which do not appear to be derived from any known variety of natural or technological activity. An alarming proportion of the bizarre booms are purportedly accompanied by the appearance of strange lights on the ground or in the sky. Seismologists refer to such inexplicable explosions as exotic events. One exotic event appears in the journals of George Nelson, a fur trader who ran a series of Hudson's Bay Company posts around Lake Winnipeg in the early 1800s. On the evening of January 25, 1809, while he was working a post at the mouth of the Dauphin River on the lake's western shore, he and a voyageur named Etienne Charbonneau heard a great noise upon the lake, resembling an extraordinary clap of thunder. Later that night, he and his men noticed that the planet Venus and an adjacent star not only seemed to be twice as large and bright as usual, but also appeared to bounce to and from each other, as to excite an uncommon degree of curiosity in everyone who beheld it. This gives me reason, Nelson continued, to relate what an Indian from the north side of this lake said in regard to the moon. He got up in the course of the night when it was yet very high, but when he went out again after having smoked his pipe and made a fire, according to his accounts, not near half an hour from when he went out the first time, he found it sinking below the horizon. 140 years after George Nelson's strange experience, on the night of March 23, 1953, residents of Niagara Falls, Ontario, and the adjacent city of Niagara Falls, New York, were startled by two successive booms and a mysterious flash of light, which erupted over the Niagara River, near the border between Canada and the United States. One witness named Joseph Pluter claimed that the first boom was louder than the second, and that the accompanying flash of light was so bright that it illuminated his neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York. Another witness, called Joseph Cloutier, grabbed a flashlight and ran towards the sound. When he came to the North Grand Island Bridge, which connects the American shore with the large river island for which it was named, Cloutier saw what he believed to be several pieces of wreckage floating down the Niagara River. One of the pieces was 6 feet long and purportedly reflected the light like aluminum. As he watched, the floating debris sank below the surface. Many locals suspected that a plane had crashed into the Niagara River, and an official at the U.S. Air Force Base in Niagara Falls allegedly confirmed that witness descriptions of the event certainly seemed indicative of a plane crash. When airports across the continent were checked, however, no planes were unaccounted for. A local resident investigated the site of the suspected crash in his own boat, but found no evidence of any wreckage there or downriver. The U.S. Coast Guard subsequently launched a search and rescue operation out of its base in Buffalo, New York that same night. A 2-hour search failed to turn up one shred of evidence as to the nature of the mysterious explosion. According to an article in the July 1953 issue of the magazine Fate, Niagara Falls authorities said that they assumed that the explosion and bright flash may have been made by a meteorite. Nothing at all was said about the possibility that they might have been another kind of aerial phenomena. 2 decades later, in a 5-month period in the late 1970s, a series of mystery booms, many of which were concurrent with sightings of mysterious flying balls of light, rippled up and down the Atlantic coast of North America. Beginning in early December 1977 and extending through the spring of 1978, tremendous sonic blasts shook houses and rattled residents from South Carolina to Massachusetts. Some retired military men likened the explosions to the sonic concussions of 8-inch Navy guns. Others suspected they were sonic booms produced by hypersonic aircraft accelerating past the speed of sound, or the acoustic byproduct of secret military weapon tests. From meteor showers and thunderclaps to oil rig explosions and earthquakes, all manner of explanations were proposed, investigated, and summarily refuted. Experts who investigated the phenomena remained baffled as to their causes, agreeing only that the mysterious explosions all seemed to have erupted high in the atmosphere, far out to sea. Eerily, many elderly men and women throughout New England muttered that the booms evoked an old story that their grandparents told them about the Seneca guns, a succession of powerful thunder-like claps heard above New York's Finger Lakes long ago, which their forebears ascribed to the muskets of ghostly Iroquois warriors. one of the last and most spectacular mystery booms to hit the Atlantic coast in the spring of 1978 took place on Bell Island, a tiny isle off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, home to several underground iron mines. Nestled in the maw of Conception Bay, on the northern shores of Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula, this unassuming island has served as a setting for countless tales of ghosts and goblins. From the malevolent fairies said to lurk in the woods and barrens, to a frightening hag whom local legend says haunts an island swamp, to ghostly miners who have been heard tapping on rocks with ephemeral picks in tunnels deep beneath the earth. On April 2nd, 1978, at about 11 o'clock a.m., a terrific explosion suddenly and unexpectedly shattered Bell Island's sleepy Sunday morning tranquility. A local man named Edward Bennett told reporters how he had been sitting at his kitchen table when forks of blue flame shot 18 inches out of his electrical sockets. Moments later, his house was shaken by a deafening bang, which he likened to that of a Luftwaffe parachute mine. Other island residents described how their televisions exploded into charred and smoking ruins. Balls of fire flew through the glass of their oven doors. Fuses shot across rooms like bullets, and old electronic equipment which hadn't worked in years suddenly burst into life. One islander named Carol O'Brien related her memory of the event to fellow Newfoundlander Joan Horwood, saying, "Before I saw anything, I heard a rumbling sound which seemed to come closer. Then I heard an explosion. The room that I was in lit up. I could see the sky was red. I ran out into the kitchen, looked out the window, and saw smoke, and I thought a house down the road a ways had exploded. But when the smoke cleared, I saw the roof was still on the house I thought had exploded. It was an experience I'll never forget." A local 12-year-old boy named Darren Bickford, who had been riding his bike on the island at the time of the explosion, claimed to have witnessed an extraordinary sight just before the boom. "I was outside riding my pedal bike," he said in an interview for Season 2, Episode 6 of the 2011 TV series Weird or What, "and I knew one of my favorite television shows came on at 11, so I was pedaling back home. As I approached the end of our driveway, all the birds stopped chirping. All the dogs stopped barking. It just went so still. All of a sudden, Bickford heard a tremendous boom, which he likened to a shotgun blast, which was instantly succeeded by a second boom. Immediately thereafter, the ground began to shake, producing what Bickford claimed was the loudest noise he has ever heard in his life. In the midst of the chaos, an unearthly globe of light appeared out of nowhere, hovering above the ground. Its body was a mesmerizing tangle of multi-shaded ribbons of blue light, which twisted and mingled with each other. Yellow and orange sparks danced on its surface, producing an awesome and terrifying spectacle. And then, just like that, Bickford said, the ball of light just disappeared into thin air. This is without a doubt the strangest, most terrifying thing I've ever seen. I was terrified, but I was transfixed by it. It was so beautiful looking, this ball of light, and the colors, and the way it swirled around. You couldn't help but stare at it, even though I was scared. I was shaken, but I loved it, and I've never seen anything like it. It was all over in 4 or 5 seconds, but those 4 or 5 seconds are burned into my brain, just like a roll of film. A girl named Barbara McKim saw another strange-looking object from her home on the mainland, about 20 kilometers or 12 miles from Bell Island. An oval-shaped luminescence hurtled from the sky towards the island's southwestern end at an angle, leaving a white beam-like tail behind it. Other mainland witnesses who saw this aerial projectile were divided as to whether the explosion erupted after the light hit the island, or while it was still in the air, although all agreed that the blast was powerful enough to rattle the windows and dishes in their own homes. After the last of the tremors died away, the people of Bell Island gathered their wits and assessed the damage caused by the mysterious explosion. Mercifully, none of the island's human inhabitants suffered anything worse than a bad shock, although the chicken coop of Darren Bickford's grandfather, James Bickford, was littered with dead hens, which had bled from their eyes and beaks. The elder Bickford's barn had been blown to matchwood, none of the boards from which bore any burns or scorch marks. At a point in his backyard, which witnesses determined to be the epicenter of the explosion, Bickford found 3 strange cone-like depressions in the snow, all of them 2 feet deep, 2 of them about 4 feet in diameter, and the third resembling a rabbit burrow. In the aftermath of the event, locals proposed an assortment of theories to account for the bizarre boom that had rocked the island. Some suggested that Bell Island had been subjected to a Soviet military test, perhaps being the recipient of a powerful electromagnetic wave shot from an EMP cannon, or the unwitting guinea pig of some weather modification experiment. Others wondered whether the citizens of Bell Island and Conception Bay were the victims of a black op mind control experiment conducted by the Canadian or American military. Others still proposed that the island had been visited by ball lightning, a rare, mysterious, and volatile globe of what is suspected to be ionized plasma, which has baffled scientists for centuries. Many historical accounts of ball lightning indicate that the ghostly globes have a tendency to float erratically through the air, and often explode with tremendous violence, leaving behind an offensive sulfurous odor. In an effort to solve the mystery once and for all, 2 teams of scientists independently headed to Bell Island to conduct their own tests. Geologists John Malpass and Ken Collerson, who worked at the Memorial University of Newfoundland in St. John's, the provincial capital, made up one of the teams. The other set of scientists to investigate the Bell Island boom consisted of plasma physicist Dr. John Warren and weapons design engineer Dr. Robert Freeman, both of whom worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, south of Los Alamos, New Mexico. Disturbingly, the Los Alamos Lab was the facility at which the first atomic bombs were created, where scientists were said to develop top-secret weapons, not unlike those to which some proposed Bell Island had served as an unsuspecting practice target. In an interview with journalist Rick Seward for a documentary on the Canadian TV program CBC News The National, John Malpass claimed that upon first meeting Drs. Warren and Freeman on Bell Island, the Los Alamos scientist asked whether he and Collerson had security clearances, a question which caught the Canadians off guard. The American scientists proceeded to explain to their Canadian counterparts that they had been aware for some weeks that a mystery boom would hit Atlantic Canada around early April, but did not know the exact time or place at which the explosion would strike. After examining the wreckage on the island and interviewing witnesses to the strange event, Drs. Warren and Freeman concluded that the Bell Island blast was caused by what they called super lightning, an extraordinarily powerful and long-lasting lightning bolt, despite that the weather at the time of the event did not appear to be conducive to lightning. Although other scientists have since arrived at the same conclusion, many Bell Island residents who witnessed the mysterious events of April 2, 1978, remain adamant that the phenomenon they experienced could not have been caused by lightning, super or not. Just beyond the mouth of British Columbia's Fraser Canyon, at the narrow end of the vast funnel of open farmland that is the Lower Fraser Valley, the Fraser River intersects a smaller vale called the Agassiz-Harrison Valley. At the northern end of this enchanting pastoral corridor, flanked on both sides by forest-covered mountains, sits a long, narrow body of water called Harrison Lake. Long before British and Chinese prospectors used it as a highway on their way to the goldfields of the Fraser Canyon, before explorers first paddled its length on behalf of the Hudson's Bay Company, Harrison Lake was shared by 2 distinct First Nations. The lake's northern shore was the home of the Lillooet Indians, an interior Salish tribe with ties to the indigenous people of British Columbia's interior plateau. The southern half of Harrison Lake, and the Harrison River itself, was the domain of the Chehalis, a Coast Salish people who had more in common with the natives of the West Coast. Despite their differences, both the Lillooet and Chehalis nations told stories about giant wild men who lived in the mountains beyond Harrison Lake, who occasionally descended from their alpine abodes to raid fish traps and drying racks in native settlements in the lowlands. The Lillooet have several names for these giants, including Lalkek, people of the earth, and Ticks. According to ethnologist James Tate, in a 1906 treatise, the Lillooet described them as being exceptionally large and strong. They dress in different kinds of bearskins, he wrote, and are so fleet of foot that they can run down deer and catch them with their hands. They live in caves in the mountains. Sometimes at night, they steal fish from the weirs and fishing stations. A strong and disagreeable odor emanates from their bodies, and even from their tracks. People who happen to smell them get sick and vomit. The Chehalis, on the other hand, according to anthropologist Wilson Duff in a 1932 paper, described the mountain giants of Harrison Lake as typically solitary creatures who appeared as men covered with dark fur, more than 8 feet tall, who leave footprints about 20 inches long. According to several traditional Chehalis stories, these creatures speak a human-like language, which bears some semblance to the Lillooet tongue. The Chehalis called these wild men Sasquatch, one of the words by which we know them today. One Sasquatch appearance in the Agassiz-Harrison Valley occurred in mid-October 1941, when Chehalis homesteader Jeannie Chapman watched a huge hairy man emerge from the forest and approach her home on Ruby Creek, southwest of Harrison Lake. Concealing her children from the wild man's gaze behind an unfurled blanket, she fled along Ruby Creek and sought refuge in the home of her father-in-law. 2 hours later, George Chapman, the man of the house, returned home to find that his shed had been broken into, and that a heavy barrel filled with dried fish had been torn apart, as if rent by powerful hands. The Sasquatch made several nocturnal visits to the Chapman's home in the days following its first appearance, tramping outside the cabin and emitting mournful howls from the nearby woods. When the terrifying intrusions persisted for over a week, the Chapman family abandoned their cabin and left Ruby Creek. The harrowing tale of George and Jeannie Chapman, though far from Canada's most famous Sasquatch story, has nonetheless appeared in several literary collections of classic Sasquatch sightings. Less well known is another frightening Sasquatch encounter, which took place about 2 weeks later, at the opposite end of Harrison Lake. One chilly evening in late October 1941, residents of the town of Harrison Hot Springs, on the lake's southern shore, were hailed by the occupants of 3 canoes approaching from the north, all of whom were clearly suffering from some terrible shock. The newcomers proved to comprise the family of Jimmy Douglas, a Lillooet clan from the community of Port Douglas, which lies at the northernmost end of Harrison Lake. Locals treated the newcomers to typical Chehalis hospitality, and received in turn a hair-raising tale. Earlier that day, without any warning, an enormous hairy wild man emerged from the forest and strode directly into Port Douglas. No such creature had been seen in the area for years, and the suddenness of its appearance and the boldness of its actions would have been sufficient to send the entire town into an immediate panic. What struck pure terror into the hearts of the locals, however, was the creature's unbelievable size. This particular specimen stood an appalling 14 feet tall, nearly twice the size of any Sasquatch Jimmy Douglas had ever heard of. As the giant sauntered leisurely through the village, the natives of Port Douglas promptly abandoned their outdoor activities and fled into their houses with their families, locking the doors behind them. Jimmy Douglas made to do the same, but his trembling fingers fumbled with the rusted bolt which secured his front door. To his growing horror, the Sasquatch slowly approached his home, easily pulled the door open, stooped low, and began to work his way through the entrance. Like the Chapmans before them, the Douglas clan relinquished their home to their unwanted guest. Fleeing out the back door, the family members piled into 3 canoes and paddled desperately down the lake. Harrison Lake, of course, is not the only Canadian locale to produce reports of Sasquatch sightings. On the other side of British Columbia, beyond the Cascade Mountains, the Interior Plateau, and the Okanagan, lie the Kootenays. According to the traditions of both the native Kootenai and Okanagan Indians, This secluded appendage of the Rocky Mountains was once haunted by wild giants. A local woodsman named John Bringsley believed he may have seen one of these giants while picking blueberries in the Kootenays in September 1960, in rugged country about 6 miles east of Nelson, at the head of a stream called Lemon Creek. An account of his experience appears in the February 1961 issue of the magazine Fate. "I was just starting to pick berries," he is quoted as having said, "and had only been there about 15 minutes. For no particular reason, I glanced up, and that's when I saw this great beast. It was standing about 50 feet away, on a slight rise in the ground, staring at me. It was 7 to 9 feet tall, with long arms and short, powerful legs, with hair covering its body. The first thing I thought was, what a strange-looking bear. It had very wide shoulders and a flat face with ears flat against the side of its head. It looked more like a hairy ape. It just stood there staring at me. Its arms were bent slightly, and it had hands, not claws. It was about 8 a.m., and I could see it very clearly. The most peculiar thing about it was the strange bluish-gray color of its long hair. It had no neck. Its ape-like head appeared to be fastened directly to its wide shoulders." Bringsley, a veteran hunter and fisherman who had lived in Kootenay country for over 35 years at the time of his encounter, was sure that the creature that stood before him was no bear. After staring at the animal for about 2 minutes, the wild man suddenly began to shuffle towards him. Terrified, Bringsley made a dash for his truck, leapt into the driver's seat, and tore down an old logging road, leaving his blueberries behind. Far northwest of Kootenay country and the Agassiz-Harrison Valley, the Hairy Man, as he is sometimes called, has appeared to residents of the American state of Alaska. One such resident was a middle-aged Aleut named Ted Anguson, who hailed from Bristol Bay, not far from the Aleutian Islands. In 1985, while on a commercial flight from Kalakuk Bay, near Alaska's southwestern end, to the easterly community of Dillingham, Anguson spotted an unusual figure standing in the bush outside the village of Manakotuk. "There was this giant thing in the trees," he told Bill Sherwonet, a nature writer from Anchorage, Alaska. "He looked not quite like a gorilla, but dark and full of hair. I'd say from the trees around him, he's between 7 and 10 feet tall. He was looking at us, watching us fly by. He didn't seem bothered at all, but he was a hairy man, all right." Instead of making his sighting known, Anguson decided to remain quiet. "I didn't want the pilot to go down there and scare the daylights out of him," he said. "I figured it would just make the thing go crazy, so I kept it to myself. But he exists, the hairy man, and he looks exactly like he's called." "Most of Alaska's native groups include some version of hairy man in the woods," wrote Bill Sherwonet in an article in the October 1995 issue of the magazine Alaska. "For some, the hairy man is gentle, for others menacing. But whether dangerous or harmless, human or ape-like, the creature most often seems to be dark-haired, larger than people, reclusive, solitary, nocturnal, and a forest or mountain dweller. It doesn't speak, but may scream, whistle, or imitate animal sounds. According to wildlife biologist Larry Van Daly, I've talked to lots of people in the Nushagak and Torgiak drainages, and the stories they tell have many similarities. One thing that's consistently said about hairy men is that they can run incredibly fast. Another is that they can jump long distances, over large rivers or trees. One hairy man was reportedly sighted near Lake Iliamna, east of Bristol Bay, in October 1957. One night, when the village was asleep, 17-year-old Myrtle Anilon watched her family's cat scamper up a ladder onto the roof. Shortly thereafter, she heard a crash, which sounded as if something fell through the ladder and through her mother's bedroom window. Myrtle and her 2 brothers investigated the commotion and found several tracks outside. These footprints were purportedly really huge but narrow, with big toes. Later that night, the family's dogs began to bark. Mom tells the boys to take a bright flashlight, Anilon told Sherwonet, and shine it where the dogs are looking, When they did, they saw two real hairy things. They thought it was two bears, standing on their hind legs. They come running in saying, "Give me a gun, a knife, anything." But my mom says, "Don't kill anything. You don't know what they are, they might be human." The boys go back out and don't shoot, but they start chasing those things all over the place. They said the things ran like humans, not bears, but were full of hair and fast. They came around 3 nights in a row, even looking in our windows. Mom said they were probably wild people, and if we don't harm them, they won't harm us, so we never bothered them anymore, and they kind of quit coming around. I never saw them, but my brothers did. 2 decades later, in the mid-1970s, the hairy man appeared once again in the wilderness outside Lake Iliamna. According to bush pilot Trig Olson, the thing was supposed to be as large as a moose standing on its hind legs. A native named Jim Coffey reportedly shot the animal, which ran off into the bush. When he examined the spot at which the creature had been shot, he found the snow stained by a red liquid, resembling transmission fluid. Over the years, several theories have been proposed as to the nature of Alaska's hairy man. Some suggested that they were feral humans who had metamorphosed in the wild, in the same way that domestic pigs bereft of human care grow coarse bristles and sharp tusks in response to nature's demands. Through the years, mused Shirley Nelson, a lifelong resident of Lake Iliamna, we've had people just disappear, with absolutely no trace. The thought is that these people have gone back to the wild, but who knows? Other northerners have suggested that hairy men abduct lone travelers and transform them into creatures like themselves, while others still have proposed that Alaska's wild man constitutes a species of undiscovered primate, straddling the border between man and beast. I have no idea what stories are behind it, concluded Ted Anguson, echoing the thoughts of many northerners, both Indian and white. All I know is that hairy man exists. I've lived in the bush and tundra all my life. Weird stuff does happen, whether people want to believe it or not. So said Anthony Roche, a native of the Canadian North, to this author in November 2017, after relating some of his own inexplicable experiences in the wilderness of Canada's Northwest and Nunavut territories. Anthony Roche is a Canadian of Mi'kmaq and Inuit descent, who has spent his entire life hunting, fishing, camping, and guiding throughout Canada's northern territories, from the legendary Headless Valley in the Mackenzie Mountains to the tundra of the high Arctic. During the course of his boreal escapades, he has seen, heard, and felt things that he cannot explain. One of his most bizarre experiences took place in August 2017, at a property outside Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, on the southern shore of Victoria Island. Some viewers may recall this story from this author's 2018 book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley. What follows is the full version of Roche's story, in his own words. This past August, my girlfriend and I were at her parents' cabin, about 10 kilometers west of Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, checking our fish net. I checked the net, while my girlfriend went for tea at her grandmother's cabin. I got 3 fish in the net, filleted them, and hung them to dry. My girlfriend and I were tired, and decided to have a nap. We both woke up to footsteps on the deck, heard the outside door open, and a few seconds later, the inside door opened. I was looking higher at the door, expecting to see our grandma, and there was the smallest human I've ever seen, wearing a ragged old orange-colored coat and caribou skin pants. Both doors shut as if they were one. My girlfriend screamed, "Someone try to get in." I jumped up to see who it was, looked out every window, and I didn't see anyone. I walked out the door and didn't see anyone. I thought to myself, Grandma can't move that fast. Her cabin is 80 yards away. So we came home and tell my in-laws what happened. They told us a little person had visited us. An Inuk, they called them. Inuagulik in our language. I haven't found out what it meant, or if it means anything at all. but they were supposed to be folk stories for children, and one walked into our cabin. Tales of little elusive men with seemingly magical abilities constitute a staple of Arctic and subarctic tradition. In his 1875 book, Tales and Traditions of the Eskimo, Danish geologist Dr. Heinrich Rink included several old Inuit stories about the Inuarutlagak, or mountain elves, said to live extraordinarily long lives in underground burrows on the islands of the Arctic archipelago. Rink's informants told him that these diminutive people were supposed to carry 2 sets of clothing with them when they traveled, one of which fit their tiny frames, and the other being large enough for a man to wear. During their wanderings, he wrote, they wore their own proper clothes, carrying the large ones with them, ready to put on in case they should get some heavy load to carry. They could then, by beating themselves, reach human size. Their way of regaining their natural appearance was by bending down to enter the cave, and hitting the crown of their heads against the roof, on which they dwindled down to their ordinary smallness. Inuit tradition contends that the elves are shapeshifters, which can assume at will the appearance of certain animals and inanimate objects, such as caribou, hares, or stones. They are also endowed with the ability to travel extraordinarily long distances extremely quickly, presumably through the use of magic. Their weapon of choice is a sort of gun, which need only be pointed at a target to kill it. They are said to be fond of dancing and playing magic tricks on each other. In his 1921 book, Eskimo Folktales, Greenlandic Danish explorer and anthropologist Knud Rasmussen described the elves as being deathly afraid of dogs on account of an unfortunate accident which took place when an elf family paid a visit to an Inuit home. Every once in a while, northerners like Anthony Roche report encounters with little elfin or dwarfish people in the wilderness of northern Canada and Alaska. One such report appeared in the October 1995 issue of the magazine Alaska by Bill Sherwonet. There are numerous native stories of little people who dwell in Alaska's mountains, Sherwonet wrote, but they tend to be leprechaun-sized beings whose bodies are not covered with hair. John Fumlikpak, a Yupik elder in New Stoyahawk, has described an Ursingarak, or mountain spirit, that he saw many years ago. It resembled a regular person, but was much shorter, carried a stick, and wore a tall, pointed hat. When Gumlikpak approached, the Ursingarak vanished into thin air. Most of the time they're invisible, he explained through a translator, but occasionally they allow themselves to be seen. Another man who claimed to have encountered an Ursingarak was Sam Stepanoff, an Aleut who lived in the villages of Perryville and Chignik Lake on the Alaskan Peninsula. One night, when he was 14 years old, Stepanoff went out with a couple of friends to harvest sea urchins. No sooner had the friends made it to the beach than a dog began to bark in the hills nearby. Stepanoff recognized the barking immediately as that of his dog, who had run off 4 days earlier. Abandoning the urchin hunt, he set off to retrieve the lost mutt. Stepanoff found his dog standing at the edge of the forest, his hair standing on end, growling at something in the trees. The teenager scooped up his dog and made to leave when he heard a rustling in the leaves. The alders made some noise right beside me, Stepanoff told Sherwonet, and I saw a person. I thought it was the boys. We used to play around, scare each other. I said, "Knock it off, I know who you are." But it didn't move. So I shined a flashlight. And it was a man, his face just pure wrinkles. I said, "Who are you?" But no answer. He's just looking straight at me, not speaking. I got so scared I dropped my dog and went down the cliff. I ran to where the others were gathering wood for a bonfire and told them what I had seen, and they took off running too. I've read all about the abominable snowman and Bigfoot, Stepanoff concluded, but this guy I seen was little, smaller than me. I could never figure it out. He just looked like a real old man, all wrinkled. He had a beard and was kind of hairy, but he was human. Another series of Northern Little People reports appeared in an article by J. and L. Nicholson in the September 29, 1992 issue of a newspaper called The Valley Sun, based out of Wasilla, Alaska. The Nicholsons referred to the tiny subjects of their article as Innikins. One man who claimed to have encountered Innikins in the Alaskan bush was 78-year-old Kenneth Ashby, who lived with his wife Ruth in the hamlet of Noatak in northwestern Alaska. His first and most dramatic run-in with the little people took place one summer day in 1938 when he was 24 years old. While fetching water from the Noatak River, he and his brother Bruce were purportedly accosted by a gang of little wild men dressed in caribou skins, who wore their forelocks cut into straight bangs. Assisted by their grandfather, who slipped on a rock and knocked himself out in the process, the brothers managed to fight off the little men and extricate themselves from the area. That same year, Ashby claimed that his sister, Victoria, chased a couple of Innikins away from their family's drying rack after catching them in the act of stealing half-dried salmon. Ashby's final encounter with Alaska's little men purportedly occurred in 1947, while traveling up the Noatak River on a hunting trip with a couple of friends from his hometown. As he walked along the riverbank, Ashby heard the cracking of dry birch leaves in the forest. He turned towards the sound with his rifle raised, and was astonished to find himself staring at a little man, similar in appearance to those whom had attacked him and his brother 9 years prior, peering at him from behind a tree. Ashby claimed that the tiny man was joined by several companions, who played a game of hide-and-seek with his fellow hunters as they traveled upriver. Lurking at the edge of the forest, the Innikins would quickly duck out of sight after being spotted, only to reappear behind a bush or tree further up the trail. When they returned to Noatak, the hunters posted guards around the hamlet as a precaution against the little people. The Innikins whistled to each other from concealment in the trees, which Ashby interpreted as some form of communication, before falling back into the bush. Another man from the Noatak River area, who asked Nicholson not to publish his name for fear that the little people would somehow find him as a result, claimed that he and his friends had unsuccessfully chased an Innikin in 1949, 1 year after Ashby's final encounter, hoping to push it into the river. That was many years ago, he told the Nicholsons, and I haven't seen any since. They still might be hiding someplace. In her 1958 book, Moonlight at Midday, American naturalist Sally Carrigar described several little people stories she learned while living in the trading post in the city of Unalaklet, on Alaska's western shore. The myths that intrigued me the most, she wrote, were those about little men. Everyone says they aren't often seen anymore. Their footprints sometimes, and the wide tracks of their sleds. But the little people are not coming down from the clouds to visit, as once they did. Almost all the Eskimos still believe in them, and when I asked why they stay away, the answer was sorrowful. Everything is so different now. One story which Carrigal related took place in 1942, when Colonel Marvin Muktuk Marston was in command of the Alaska Territorial Guard. This martial unit, colloquially referred to as the Eskimo Scouts, was a ragtag militia composed of Inupiat, white, and Native American volunteers, formed for the purpose of defending Alaska against a potential Japanese invasion. One day, while conducting a routine drill, Marston's officers informed him that their soldiers were unable to properly execute their maneuvers as they kept running into little men. After some consideration, Marston ordered his soldiers to treat the little men as enemy combatants and drive them from the area. He sent his troops on that mission, Carrigar wrote. When they reported that they had accomplished it, the regular military exercises went forward. The most recent appearance of the little men, at the time of Carrigar's Arctic tenure, occurred in the winter of 1946, in the Inupiat city of Norvik, on the shores of the Kobuk River, about 200 miles north of Inalakleet, beyond the other side of the Seward Peninsula. The summer of 1946 was a particularly hungry one for the residents of Norvik. Hoping to intercept a caribou herd, a handful of hunters set out into the wilderness with their sleds. After several days of traveling, the hunters exhausted their provisions and began to despair that their enterprise would end in failure. One moonlit night, when hope among the hunting party was failing fast, one of the disheartened Inupiats glanced out the entrance to his tent and saw a scene that caused him to sit bolt upright. The slope beyond their campground was crawling with hundreds of little people who ran silently atop the snow, beckoning for the hunters to follow them. Quickly hitching their teams up, Carragher wrote, the Eskimos followed and came to a huge herd of caribou. They killed hundreds and took the meat and hides home on their sleds. Back at Norvik, when one of the women unpacked her skins, a little man who had been hiding in them jumped out and ran away. When someone tells a ghost story, there is usually an implication that the spectral subject or subjects of the tale constitute spirits of the dead, perhaps trapped in limbo between our world and the great beyond, perhaps unable to move on due to some unusually powerful ties to or unresolved business on Earth. Consciously or not, these spirits are said to attract our attention by presenting our senses with distinguishing features reminiscent of their pre-humus selves, visibly appearing to us as they did in life, speaking to us in their old earthly voices, or manifesting as aromas evocative of perfumes they once wore, or cigars they once smoked, before the final guttering of what the bard called their brief candle. It is more difficult to rationalize ghost stories in which the subject is a vehicle, crewed or occupied by several souls, such as a phantom ship, a ghostly automobile, or a spectral carriage. With the exception of Stephen King and a few overzealous auto mechanics, most of us Westerners scoff at the idea of a lifeless machine like a car or an airplane possessing a soul capable of living on after the final sputterings of its engine have consigned its metal frame to the scrapyard. Nevertheless, sightings of ghostly ships crewed by ghostly sailors, phantom carriages pulled by phantom horses, and other vehicular apparitions are staples of regional folklore. This disturbing reality begets uncomfortable questions. Is it possible that old ships really do have souls, as some schools of maritime superstition have long contended? Could the spirits of railwaymen who lost their lives in a train wreck, lest their tragic ends be forgotten, collectively project a visual portrait of their last moments on Earth onto our mortal plane? In this piece, we'll take a look at one of Canada's most interesting types of vehicular apparitions, the phenomenon of the ghost train. Readers of this author's work may already be familiar with the phantom train of Medicine Hat, Alberta, a strange story, first written down by columnist Ken Little of the Lethbridge Herald in the spring of 1966, and immortalized in Albertan Senator F.W. Gershaw's 1967 book, Samus, the Medicine Hat. Andrew Stasko began Little in his original article, who retired in 1955 after 48 years in Canadian Pacific train service, pulled his treasured engineer's watch from his shirt pocket, where he has carried it since vests went out of style. It was time for us to catch the phantom train. You can believe or disbelieve the story Mr. Stasko told, but he produced documented evidence that something mighty strange happened on 2 occasions amid cutbanks on the line between Medicine Hat and Dunmore in the summer of 1908. Little went on to explain how, in the early 1900s, an engineer named Bob Toohey and a stoker named Gus Day worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway out of the city of Medicine Hat, Alberta, in the southeastern corner of the province. One night in May 1908, these 2 associates were tasked with bringing a train from Medicine Hat to the easterly town of Dunmore, coupling with a passenger train called the Spokane Flyer, and continuing west beyond Lethbridge and into the Crow's Nest Pass. At a point about 2 miles outside of town at that time, where the Canadian Pacific Railway climbs out of the South Saskatchewan River Valley and onto the open prairie, the Canadian Pacific Railway wraps around a cutbank fronting a stream called Ross Creek. This cutbank obstructs the view of the tracks on both sides, preventing both eastbound and westbound trainmen from seeing what lies around the corner. On that fateful night, while they were making their way around the cutbank, Bob Toohey and Gus Day heard a sound that made their blood run cold. The warning whistle of an oncoming train, fast approaching from the east. Moments later, a train's headlights appeared around the cutbank, heralding an imminent head-on collision. Before Day had time to leap from the gangplank, or Tui the opportunity to crank the brake lever, the approaching locomotive glided laterally off the tracks and sped past, floating on the air. Day stood at the cab doorway, and Tui's hand remained suspended for the brake valve, Little wrote, as a string of phantom coaches sped past. The coach windows were lighted, and crew members waved a greeting from places where crew members would be expected to be found waving greetings as trains passed. And then the phantom disappeared. Tui and Day, each fearful of what the other might have thought had they expressed feelings, said nothing. They continued to Dunmore, coupled to the Spokane Flyer, and finished the night without further incidents. 2 weeks after the strange event, Tui and Day encountered each other on the streets of Medicine Hat. Both men had spent the interim consumed by thoughts of their bizarre experience, and found the courage to ask what the other had seen that night. To their relief, Tui and Day found that their recollections of the event were identical. Tui proceeded to explain that the apparition had spooked him so thoroughly that he had gone to see a fortune-teller, who predicted that he would die within the month. In an effort to forestall his upcoming appointment with his maker, he decided to take a few days off work. Day, on the other hand, could not afford that luxury, and was compelled to remain on the job. A few nights after his conversation with Tui, Day found himself working on the same engine, this time alongside an engineer named Jay Nicholson. At exactly the same spot, Little wrote, the phantom train again appeared, headed toward them with whistle blowing and headlight burning. And again it simply evaporated into the darkness, as its crew members again waved greetings from their positions on its engine and cars. On the morning of June 8, 1908, Gus Day was assigned to yard service, and a stoker named Harry Thompson took his place in the engine room. Thompson's crew, led by engineer Jay Nicholson, was to take their train from Medicine Hat to Dunmore, couple with the Spokane Flyer, and travel east to the town of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. They left Medicine Hat and headed into the hills, Little wrote. About 100 yards from the spot where the phantom train had been seen on 2 different nights and by 2 different crews, another train appeared around a curve, headed straight for them. This time it was daylight, and it was for real. It was number 514, the passenger train coming in from Lethbridge, and the man at the throttle was Bob Tui, who had overcome his fears and returned to work. A front-page article in the next day's issue of the Medicine Hat News explained what happened next. The collision took place on the elevated piece of track just in front of the Pruitt Brickyard property. One of the workmen was just about to cross the track from the west side and was in such a position that he could see both trains, which each was blocked from view of the other by the high cut bank, around which the track makes an abrupt curve of this point. He waved frantically to engineer Tui, and the latter apparently realized the danger as he sprang back and reversed his engine. Just as he appeared at the cab door again, the 2 engines met, and a dense pall of steam and smoke settled over the wreck for some minutes. When it cleared away, the sight presented was one which will never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Engine number 702, Spokane Flyer, was forced back off its front truck, and the whole front of the boiler head was torn off. The express car on the Crow train had been partially telescoped through the mail and baggage car and a tourist car. All 3 cars rolled into the ditch with the locomotive. Engineer Nicholson was quite dead when drawn from the wreck, as was Howard Gray, fireman of the Crow engine. Baggage man Archambault was instantly killed when his car telescoped. The 2 passengers which were also killed were Messrs. Jas Shaw and Duncan McEachran of Bow Island. 3 more men were seriously injured in the crash and were taken to the Medicine Hat Hospital in precarious condition. One of these was Bob Tui, whose leg was broken and whose body had been battered. True to the fortune-teller's predictions, the engineer soon succumbed to his injuries. In retrospect, Medicine Hat's phantom train, if Gus Day's story can be believed, appears to have been some sort of omen portending the crash of June 8th, a sort of locomotive doppelganger. This same sentiment appears in another prairie ghost story from the American state of Texas, which appeared in the October 1962 issue of the magazine Fate. The witness, Mr. Thomas Phillips, of Pasadena, Texas, claimed to have left the city of Belleville, Texas, on the evening of January 10, 1960, bound for the southerly city of Sealy. Phillips was on a multi-day business trip, and as it was too late for him to do any work in Sealy, he decided to take it easy and drive slowly. The Texas State Highway 36 was almost deserted at that time of night. At one point, while driving down a slight grade, Phillips spotted the lights of two oncoming cars far in the distance. As he gazed at the headlights, something in the ditch about 300 feet before him caught his attention. There seemed to be a cloud of fog moving slowly toward the road, he wrote. As I approached, I saw an old-style locomotive emerging from the very midst of the cloud and moving into the road in front of me. Being very close, I applied my brakes. As I watched the engine move across in front of me, I realized there was not a light of any kind on it, nor were there any crossing lights, signs, or signals. I became very angry, and from the bottom of my heart, condemned anyone who would be so stupid as to run a locomotive across a state highway without any warning. Then I noticed that even though my car had excellent lights, they were failing to light up the engine. I could see very clearly the road between the front of my car and the engine, but when they should have shone upon the engine, they just didn't. The engine seemed to be lighted from a source entirely apart from the lights of my car, but as it moved across the road, it came between me and the cars in the distance, and I could not see their lights anymore. The engine slowly passed and was followed by freight cars. As I sat there watching them go by, I could see the light from the horizon between them, but I still could not see the lights from the automobiles in the distance. As freight car after freight car passed, I kept waiting for the caboose, but it never came. The last was just another boxcar. Then suddenly, the lights of the automobiles reappeared in the distance, and my great surprise came when I realized that there was no sign of a railroad bed, not even a break in the pavement where one had ever been. Shaken and eager to share his unnerving experience, Phillips pulled into the nearest establishment, a late-night roadside restaurant. Inside, he struck up a conversation with the restaurant owner and told him about the Phantom train. The businessman affirmed that there weren't any railroads in the area, let alone any that crossed the highway. When Phillips asked his opinion on the matter, the restaurant owner, clearly reluctant to discuss the subject, muttered, "It's a warning," without offering any further explanation. While the spectral subjects of the previous two stories were supposed to be premonitions of disaster, another ghost train spotted in December 1885 appeared in the wake of a tragedy, almost as if to lament the event, or as if to carry the soul of the boy who lost his life therein to a brighter place. This story appears in the 1966 book, Legends of Prince Edward Island, written by folklorist Frank Harold MacArthur. As the book's title would suggest, the tale is set on Prince Edward Island, or PEI, Canada's smallest province, located in the Gulf of St. Lawrence along the borders of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. About 12 miles east of the PEI city of Summerside, on the unofficial border separating the more populous eastern half of the province from the more wild country, which islanders affectionately refer to as Up West, lies the quaint Acadian village of Wellington, situated at the head of the Grand River. It is in this rural community that our tale is set. Going back to December of 1885, MacArthur began, we find the island sleeping under a blanket of snow. The day of December 6th dawned bright, and the air was heavy with hoarfrost. At a place called the Mill House, a large frame dwelling, great preparations were going forward for a wedding supper that night. The bride-to-be was the miller's daughter, beautiful Janet Crosby. The groom, one of Charlottetown's gay young blades, by the name of Hilbert Coates. While the newlyweds' 60-something guests made their way toward the wedding reception, a group of local boys were trying out primitive pioneer ice skates called woodstocks on a pond within sight of the mill house. Vying for a prize put forward by the local blacksmith, who invented the skates, the boys partook in a speed skating competition across the pond. At the height of the contest, one of the skaters broke through thin ice and began to drown. The boy's elder brother, named John, dove after the flailing child, but was unable to rescue him from the frigid water. A local woman named Mrs. Davis, who had been walking by the pond at the time of the accident, managed to help John from the icy hole. Tragically, by the time John's brother was pulled from the water, he was already dead. The young boy's body was subsequently carried into the mill house, transforming the reception hall into a funeral home. Come midnight, Arthur wrote, a train was heard in the distance. All wondered at this, as the regular train had passed some hours before. Suddenly, the whistle shattered the stillness of that December night, followed by the ringing of the train's bell, as the iron horse rounded a curve in the railroad, not half a mile away. Wedding guests and mourners alike watched the mysterious locomotive fly over the railway bridge near the mill house and disappear around another bend. Some witnesses claimed to have seen the silhouette of a solitary passenger walking down the aisle of a coach car. Others reported seeing a lady sitting alone in one of the coaches, clutching a dog which barked as the train flashed past. All recalled the eerie light that poured from the train's headlamp. Among the wedding guests, MacArthur wrote, was a section man, James Ferguson, of Summerside. He and a couple of pals arrived by trolley car, as far as Wellington section, so on hearing the train, they rushed to the station to retrieve the trolley before the train struck it. Soon, the young fellows returned to say that they'd removed the trolley, stepped aside to let the train go by, but to their amazement, it just melted from view before their eyes. On enquiries at Summerside, it was learned that no train was dispatched that night. Not all phantom trains are messengers or harbingers of disaster. An excerpt of a letter written from a son to his father, which appeared in newspapers across Canada, the United States, and England throughout the summer of 1898, described one locomotive apparition, which the letter writer at least attributed to some mysterious but natural phenomenon. The anonymous author began his story at a desolate train station at a place called Shawnewan, now a community called Domain, Manitoba, located about 20 miles south of Winnipeg. While waiting for his train to arrive, the writer watched the weather quickly degenerate into a bone-chilling winter storm, complete with howling wind, swirling mist, and icy sheets of wind-blown snow. Shivering next to a telegraph pole, which he used as a windbreak, the writer was delighted when his ride suddenly emerged from the snowy haze. He enthusiastically grabbed his bag and waved his handkerchief in the air, only to watch the approaching train stop about 50 yards from the station. Not wishing to spend one more moment than necessary exposed to the harsh Manitoban elements, the man ran towards the locomotive when it mysteriously and suddenly disappeared. The writer stopped dead in his tracks, unable to reconcile his mind to what his senses had perceived. For several minutes, he stood beside the tracks in stunned amazement when the train broke through the wintry gloom a second time. This time, the locomotive glided off the track and ran across the prairie before melting back into the haze from which it had emerged. It gave me quite an eerie feeling, the Sun wrote, and I began to think that the cold had gotten into my head, and I cast superstitious glances around me to see if there were any more trains frolicking about in the snow. And suddenly I bethought me of what I had heard about the mirage. The writer went on to hypothesize that both of his phantom train sightings were contemporaneous visions of the actual train, which arrived a few minutes later, projected by some curious action of the wind and the cold. Next week, we'll take a look at inexplicable phantom lights seen over railways across the Great White North, another of Canada's many railway mysteries.